Okay, well, thank you all very much for joining us. One or two are still straggling in at the back of the room as usual, but there's a few of us here. So thank you very much for joining us to talk with Joan Bakewell and welcome Joan. I did ask one of our fellows earlier today whether she was going to be able to come along to this event, and she said, "What do you mean? Of course, Joan Bakewell's a legend." so
still alive.
a living legend. So to introduce Joan Bakewell, the living legend, Joan Bakewell, you will all know, but of course done all sorts of fascinating things that no doubt you'll ask about. One thing I thought I should point to it, so in introduction, is the strong common bond with Kellogg College, because Kellogg was sponsor of the report from the Centenary Commission on Adult Education, sponsored by the Adult Education 100 campaign, which was building on the 1919 report on adult education. I'll just take a second to say about this because it's very relevant today and the pandemic and so on. During the devastation, the horrors of World War I, the Prime Minister Lloyd George set up a Ministry for Reconstruction to think what on earth could be done to reconstruct society and the economy after such horrors. And probably the most impactful thing the Ministry of Reconstruction did was publish the 1919 report on adult education, saying that adult education, lifelong learning, was absolutely fundamentally important, and all universities should conduct adult education, lifelong learning. And Joan Bakewell very kindly agreed to be a patron of the Adult Education 100 campaign. And when I wrote to her asking whether she would, I was co-secretary. I got a lovely handwritten letter back saying she'd be delighted, and she still remembered her parents going off for their WEA, Works Education Association classes to learn everything from Beethoven to philosophy, she said, including one class she remembered they did on philosophy, on Is Picasso Having Us On? Which I think segues nicely with our creative writing and other students who not only understand the importance of lifelong learning and adult education, but having a broad-based education and not just being narrowly focused on skills for jobs. So Joan has very kindly said that she's very keen to hear from you, talk to as many of you as possible. And of course, she'll have a better chance this time next year when she's able to come properly and have a glass of champagne with you all after the talk and then over guest night dinner. But in the meantime, do just write any questions in the chat or raise your hand. I'll ask one or two questions to get the ball rolling, but do raise your hand or put a question in the chat as soon as you'd like to come in and take over. But I want to start off with that question linked to adult education, lifelong learning. I mean, not only is Joan a patron of the Adult Education 100 campaign, but she is also president of Birkbeck College in London, which is very much a sort of sister organization to Kellogg. In fact, I think maybe we should formalize that relationship and become sister organizations, because Birkbeck was established for the spreading the blessings of knowledge to the working people of London, and has been dedicated to enabling people to come and do degrees after work, starting at 6 o'clock in the evening, from 6 to 9 in the evening. So Joan, I want to start off with that, and just ask for your reflections about lifelong learning, adult education, continuing education. I mean, not just its importance, but what we collectively at Birkbeck, Kellogg and elsewhere can do to try to get the message home, to get the decision makers to realize just not just how important it is to society, but what an fantastic investment opportunity is, that you get so much back economically, but also culturally in terms of society, democracy and everything else if you got people engaged with education.
Yes, I'm amazed that in a way it fell off the agenda when people had to go down the pits or work in the mills, in fact, as my grandparents did. And it was very interesting that in my early days, there was something called the Mechanics Institute locally. And that was where my parents went as mature people. My mother was a housewife, bored housewife. My father worked as an engineer, and they went along for these Mechanics Institute classes, which were the WEA, the Workers' Educational Association, which still exists, of course. And when I went to Cambridge, got a scholarship to Newnham, in the course of talking about it, I said, well, of course, my parents were associated with the WEA. And so class-ridden was Cambridge at that time that the students turned to me and said, oh, what did they lecture on? And I had to say, oh no, they were working class people, they went to learn. And I thought how interesting that was, because education has been dogged by class distinctions in many ways. I mean, the public schools, which of course are private schools, are reserved for people with money. And I don't suppose many of them go in for much further education, which they would be wise to do so, given their performance in the outer world, I think. So I've always cherished the idea that my parents went along late at night to try just to improve their knowledge of things for its own sake. And I've always followed that pursuit myself. And I don't think curiosity ever dies as part of the human personality. And it's that we need to indulge. Of course, it has a cash value, it has a career value, it has all the other things that come with that. But at basis is the curiosity of the human animal, which should never be satisfied. We should go on being curious about everything in the world, every subject in the world. And I've often said, as president of Birkbeck, oh, I wish I was a student, I'd still love to come. And the directors always said, choose your subject. And I said, I couldn't begin to choose which one to study.
Yeah, well, that's very much the heart of Kellogg College as well. But I think this is maybe an unanswerable question, but I'll ask it anyway, which is why it's so difficult for us to get this message home and get governments to actually fund it properly. Now, you might say, well, it's because of the funding bit, but everyone one talks to, and all the political parties, all say, yeah, they agree completely. They're totally supportive of lifelong learning. It's becoming increasingly important for society as well as the economy and so on. And yet when they get into government, at most, they'll talk about skills for jobs currently, and they forget all about the wider issues or funding it properly.
Yes, I find that their attitude is slightly patronizing in that, yes, of course it's important. And they mean it's important for other people. They mean it's important for perhaps workers who they know who would perform better in the businesses they run, or in different arenas of activity where they feel that other people could do with a leg up, but possibly not themselves. I do have a sense that they feel it's for others and for people also who have lost out. And I think it may well be true of many people who have not had the opportunities early on. For example, I know that people have been recruited to come to Birkbeck who were sort of hairdressers and just never passed any exams. And they come along and say, do you mean I can get an education late in life? And a lot of people don't realize that you can. And of course, the most disadvantaged financially, socially, are the very people to whom it wouldn't occur to try to get some late learning. And I often wonder how we should go about recruiting people like that, who could benefit from an education, but would also flourish and use their often misapplied intelligence when they kind of feel bored or reckless or out of sorts with society. If they used the opportunities that we know exist, and they perhaps don't, I think they would find much greater life satisfactions. I don't mean earning money. I mean, of course, it's nice to earn money and one would want them to, but the more fundamental thing to me is life satisfaction, however you choose to measure it. And it's up to individuals to measure it for themselves. They know when they've got it.
Yeah, good. Can I ask you switch tack, because I hugely enjoyed reading your autobiography and then your more recent book, and it's just amazing that the people you've met and interviewed and so on, well, on BBC throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. I just recently saw that film, The Trial of the Chicago 7, which I'd recommend to anyone if they've seen it. It was an incredibly, very striking film, you know, back in '68, and very evocative, the anti-Vietnam War protests, and the role of Tom Hayden, who then went on to become governor of California. And I read one or two reviews of it, but honestly, the best review of that period, and actually that sort of courtroom almost, was, Joan, your sort of half-page description of it, which you'd written 10 years ago or something, from having met and interviewed Tom Hayden and the others at the time. But yes. Is there anyone particular you'd pull out of all? I mean, you list so many names of the people that you've obviously interviewed.
It's very interesting. I have seen the film, and William Kunstler, whom I interviewed at the time, was a really quite different figure from the one that Mark Valance plays, if you remember. Is that Mark? I forgot, somebody there will correct me the name of the actor. He was a huge personality, Kunstler, tremendous. Tom Hayden was extremely purposeful, very intelligent, and simply on the path of a political career. And they were all tremendously vigorous people, but I only actually got to interview those two. And 1968 in America was a very exciting time. I mean, change was racing forward, with all sorts of terrible things happening, of course, assassinations and so on. But the Democrats were bent on change, and I went there to sort of take some measure of it for BBC television.
Yeah, well, it was segue slightly from civil rights, because one other thing I wanted to ask you about was sort of discrimination and you know, what to do about it, because you give examples throughout your books about discrimination as relating to women, and then more recently older people, because you were actually asked by government to be sort of voice of older people, to sort of look through legislation and so on. But well, I wonder what you thought about that, because on the one hand, it seems to be such horror stories come up, you know, now about discrimination against women and so on, and yet, you know, some of the stuff you describe is just day-to-day stuff in the 60s and 70s was
yes, I mean, it was assumed that men were predators, and wherever you went to work, it was the time in the late 50s and 60s was the time when women, over a much broader spectrum of opportunity, moved into the workforce. So there was a huge arrival of women into what was a male community. And the men were used to being their predatory habits and were quick to pinch and stroke and hug and generally interfere with women. And women didn't know what to expect, because they lived at home with their families in a world also where men had all the big jobs, and the kind of strong jobs, the macho jobs, were down the pit or in the factory, or in the armed forces, because the war hadn't been over for very long. The emergence of the women in the services was very important at that time. But women, in a sense, didn't know how to shape their place in society. So they put up with a lot of this harassing rubbish for quite a long time, because they didn't come together to say, we're not having this, we're not having this. And only slowly, of course, have they begun to shape it and to insist on laws. And it was because Harriet Harman was in some way responsible for the Equality Bill. And she thought we must include the old and make sure that they are not discriminated against. And she said, how can we make that acceptable? We need to have it known. And so she came to me and said, will you sort of write about it? Will you go and CO people? Will you try and reflect in the public media things that they care about? And I was quite happy to do that. It was very interesting to do. I learned a lot, which has stood me in good stead when it came to speaking out for older people, and also for making life go on longer. You know, why should it stop at retirement? I'm talking about the exhilaration of a successful working life. Of course, a boring working life is to be brought to an end with some joy. Yeah. But the opportunities that arrive when you retire are many and various. I mean, a whole lot of people start taking degrees at Birkbeck and perhaps at Kellogg, I don't know. But it is a wonderful opportunity, retirement, to have a second life, a second opportunity. And that means it actually has brought longer life years into people. People are living longer because of the celebration that they find in discovering new subjects to study and skills to acquire.
Mm. Yeah, Joe Biden seems to be doing all right at age 78 today. I'll throw it open to everyone else. Come in with your questions. I just wanted to ask one more before doing so, which Joan, is your role in the House of Lords. I mean, some people, particularly from other countries, well, I'd say a lot of us probably don't know what the House of Lords is or does. I mean, I know you actually work very hard in there, review legislation, trying to improve it, here or there. But could you say something about that, about what your role is in the House of Lords?
I was asked to be a Labour peer. I was asked to be a working Labour peer by Ed Miliband. And I did balk at the idea, really, because I think it's an institution that needs huge reform. And I still believe it does. Everyone who serves in the House of Lords believes it should be reformed, I can tell you. It's unwieldy and it's often open to abuse, in which people appoint, prime ministers appoint their supporters as a reward for services and loyalty and things like that. Whereas the existing body of the House of Lords consists of a lot of very clever people with backgrounds in law, a lot of judges, a lot of diplomats, people who are British ambassadors across the world. The heads of civil service are all there with a wry comment to make about contemporary events. So they bring a sort of lifelong wisdom from their own background to bear on whatever subject is being discussed. And that's really interesting. And anyone who's very good at it will attract an audience of other peers who don't know much about their subject. I mean, if we think about Skidelsky, for example, talking about the economy, then people will see his name is on the list to speak and will go into the chamber, leave their office to go into the chamber to hear him because he'll be worth hearing. And that is true of people who speak about policing or foreign affairs. If there's someone there with knowledge, you turn up to learn. So there's a great enthusiasm for expertise in the Lords.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Okay. So over to you. Anyone who wants to ask a question, just either please put your hand up or put something in chat. But while you're thinking about that, Shreya, I was talking to Shreya earlier, and Shreya, I don't know if you want to come in, because I was wanting to sort of follow up my question about women and older people about discrimination, but I know that you're infinitely more qualified than I am to ask the question that I wanted to.
Where will I find you?
Shreya, you.
Hi, Joan.
Hello, there you are.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. It is really wonderful to be hearing this conversation, and Joan you're truly living legend. So thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to hosting you at Kellogg next year. When you are answering to Jonathan's question about discrimination, you're talking about women and older people, and I'm a discrimination lawyer and I work on intersectionality. So what I was hearing was, what about the category of older women? And I want to ask you something about your background in journalism and the media industry. So it turns out that older women, especially TV presenters, have brought so many cases against the BBC specifically, arguing that they've been discriminated against both on the basis of age as well as their gender. And somehow the employment tribunal just always ends up saying, well, choose one. It's either sex or gender or your age. And I wonder what you think about your experience in the industry. Why is it so peculiar in the industry that it always comes down to this very particular category? And I mean, I can say about why lawyers don't seem to understand it, but it seems that there's something very particular about the industry, which is.
I think there's something very particular. I think there's something very particular about the BBC, which I think is a highly overmanaged institution, in which if you have a BBC career, you move up through different layers of management. You give up the really exciting thing, which I believe is making programs. The person who agrees with me about that, by the way, is David Attenborough, who in his heyday was the controller of BBC Two and was being groomed to be the director general of the BBC. And he went to them and said, no, I want to give all this management stuff up. I want to go back to making programs. And they all thought, no. The career thing is to climb the ladder and become management, where you never meet any people who make programs. You just issue ruling about them. And he said, no, I just want to be out in the field making programs. what a career he's had. But the point is the administrative layers of the BBC management are rather clogged with people attending meetings with other such managers to make decisions about people they don't meet very often. So there is a sense that when there is an issue like the equal pay for women, which is not entirely resolved within the BBC, they fight a rearguard action. They don't embrace the problem and say, yes, let us find a route forward. And not only that, but let us find a route towards the future as it should be. What they do is they say, how can we defend what we have and what we believe in against this assault from the inside of people who want to change us? I'm caricaturing it, of course, to some extent, but I'm trying to make it clear what is happening, because I know lots of women who are working as the equal of male producers, for example, and doing the same work and not getting the same pay. And they've been saying so for a long time. And people say, yes, we'll set up a committee, we'll have an inquiry, we'll draw up a report. And then they draw up a report, we'll have recommendations. And then they'll put the recommendations out for consultation. And this is how institutions avoid change. They really do. They sit on the information and they congratulate each other on your report was very good. Oh, that's interesting. We can take it a stage further. It's characteristic of all government departments too, and of human behavior in general. But of course, a whole group of people, all people who are discriminated against, whether it's race or gender or whatever, suffer from this and are waiting for change and want change to be faster. And I don't know what the answer is, because to get change, to participate in change, the obvious way is to join the management ladder. And people don't want to do that. What people with ambition do is they often leave and set up themselves as independent companies. And of course, the media landscape now allows that to happen. And there are a very great many small independent companies, very carefully financed. Their business plans are cut to the limit, and they employ creative people to make programs, and they live on commissions from these great institutions. They depend on making good programs. If you don't make good programs, you're out of business. And that's where the talent in our business now resides. I mean, for example, in the film world, Ken Loach has been running his own company, making his own films on his own terms for something like 30 years. But Ken still has to struggle to finance a film. He has to go cap in hand to find money to make films that then go on to win awards at Cannes and so on, become legendary parts of a great career. So perhaps it's inevitable that there are the makers, the doers, and then the planners who kind of sit on their aspirations. I don't know how you solve it. I think people might be becoming impatient with the BBC's rather constipated way of working. I don't know, because I've not been inside it for a long time, but I have, as you can see, a certain skepticism towards it.
Treya, did you want to come back on that at all?
Sure. I wonder if is a post BBC world imaginable? Do you think the smaller companies will hold sway in future?
Well, we know that the present government, the present Prime Minister, wants in some way to take the power away from the BBC. That has always been so. Churchill led a huge attack on the BBC in the 20s. When the general strike hit, he wanted to take over the BBC and said, this is a government matter. We'll take over the BBC as the great communicator. And Lord Reith, to do him credit, just saw him off and just said, I'm sorry, off my territory, off my lawn. So governments have always sought to influence the BBC, and they do it by threatening to take away their license, to give them too little money, and to generally make life hard for them. And so what happens, as has happened recently, and has always happened to some extent if the government can get away with it, is that they appoint as chair of the BBC someone who will play along with their agenda. And I suspect, with all respect to his talents, that the current chairman is more sympathetic to the Prime Minister's ambitions than perhaps the programme makers themselves. So there will continue to be attacks on the BBC. There's no doubt about that, because it has a lot of power. What it does have, and the House of Lords reflects this well, if there's a word is spoken about the BBC or British influence abroad, the BBC is cited as soft power, global soft power. If you talk about the BBC in Malaysia or Kuwait or anywhere at all, they first of all, it's known and it's a good brand. So it's an incredible national investment. And that is the case that you hear made by the aging people in the House of Lords who remember how important it was, for example, during the war, when the BBC was listened to in secret by people in all sorts of hazardous situations when that war was being fought. So be ready for a struggle to keep the BBC to survive and have your say. I mean, there will be a struggle about it and we need to be alert to it. I can't imagine it being dismantled. I think what will happen is somebody will propose that it becomes a hub of news and current affairs and that the rest is kind of ditched because we can't afford it. But I would regret that because, of course, some marvelous creative work goes on there.
Yeah, and on the discrimination point, I read Shreya's book on intersectionality and couldn't understand why her lawyer colleagues wouldn't understand the point she was making, that this discrimination does happen, you know, which combines two things. And actually, Joan, reading your autobiography, when you made the point that when women presenters get to a certain age, they got moved out, I thought, well, that just proves Shreya's point. You know, men can get away with it at least for a bit longer. But if it's the two combined, being an older woman, they just move them on.
What is interesting is that the people themselves who make the programs can bring about change, because when I worked for a program called Late Night Lineup in the 60s, my colleagues, my co-presenters discovered I was earning much less. And they got together and went to the editor and said, we all feel she's the equivalent of us and she should earn as much. And that was changed by the editor under pressure from my colleagues. So never underestimate the power of unity among people who have a shared common interest in creative skill. That's very important.
Yes, unfortunately, Issy Clark has put in the message. She had to dash off, but she did leave a message saying, sadly, I have to go to another meeting, but to flag up, I am a female TV reporter. I'm 50 now, and for the past 20 years, only my voice is broadcast. The face is too old. Oh. P.S. I saw Joan in a talk about Hokusai, truly a living legend. And once someone said my broadcast voice was like hers, the best compliment I ever received.
Oh, how very nice that is. How very nice that is. It is interesting about the older faces, because it's perfectly acceptable to male reporters from around the world to have sort of craggy, sort of aging faces. That gives them wisdom and authority. And it also gives them a certain buccaneering air when they tread around, you know, dangerous territory and so on. It's harder for women to do that, although they are beginning to allow women to grow old. Thank you very much. They're allowing them to grow old as reporters. But, you know, the likes of John Simpson and so on have, you know, they've aged in the way that I have, and they can carry it off in a way that perhaps somebody somewhere is saying, do you think she's perhaps past it? No, we will not know. We will not be privy to those discussions, but we've got to continue doing the job.
Yeah. Now, Bridget Whitehead, you've had your hand up for a long time. Do you want to switch your camera on? Yeah.
Yes.
Where's Bridget?
Let me just get rid of the hand. Hello. I just want to say that there's quite a lot in the name when we're talking about continuing education. I come from Austria, and the word is Volkshochschule. Volks is the people, not workers. So from the age of 14, I've been involved. So first it was the piano lessons that were provided. And the second thing was, by the time I was 16, I would be going to 2 or 3 evening classes a week. I was at grammar school, simply to top up the things that I found fascinating, to learn more. And at no stage was anybody ever saying to me that anything to do with monetary gain. It was expected that you would do. And I was a girl of 16, 17 amongst older people. And when I came to England in 1977, people said to me, why would you want to go to evening class? And the idea that I wanted to better myself and just learn about the country and find out something quickly was alien. I think it's in the name, you know, that there's this image, it's worker, it's working, it's for a job, it's for monetary gain. When it is.
Who organised these classes, Bridget?
It's in Austria, I presume it's the government. The government financed it.
Local
and it was very cheap.
Yeah.
Yes, and they were held in local schools. And I don't think it was a case of a certain number of people had to come, because I taught in England, I taught evening class adult education in England too. And it was a case of you had to have 15 people. So at one stage I taught a French beginners class, and for the next level we didn't have enough people, but one of them was a police inspector. So I held the course in the local police station and in the bar. It was wonderful. It was the way around it. So I became a private club.
I'm sure that if we did begin to offer that up, particularly to children who found school rather boring,
Yes.
not interesting, if it was offered with a little flair in the evenings into subjects that they might enjoy, like, you know, rock drumming.
Photography.
Let's have classes about drummers. And all bring our drum kit. Let's see what we can learn. Who can we copy, and so on. That would use up the energy and the sense of curiosity of young people.
And if you get rid of the word adult in the program and make it, I don't know what it would be in England, but it was folk in German, you know, which is the population.
Yes, we don't have quite the equivalence of language.
No.
I don't know what we can do about that.
It's just an idea.
Continuing education is often used,
yes,
isn't it? Lifelong learning. I think lifelong learning is nice.
It is. I like that.
I think it should go on right to the end.
Definitely. It's a pleasure seeing you. I've been following you for years as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget. Tara? You want to put your camera on?
Hello.
Hello. I see you now.
I'm a fellow at Kellogg in English Lit and Creative Writing. So my question's a bit different. I hope that's all right. From peers to peers with an I. I noticed that you're a big fan of peers. Is that right?
I am. P-I-E-R. Yes, I am.
To the sea. And I was just wondering, because I really like them as well, and I particularly things like Graham Greene's Brighton Rock and those kinds of things. And I like to think of them as these kind of fading signs of British culture, but obviously they're also under threat. I wondered whether you could tell us a bit more about your passion for peers. And I think it's quite interesting talking about the BBC and these kind of bastions of British culture and how they're changing their kind of uses, I suppose. Are peers an emblem of that as well, do you think?
Well, peers are peers, and there are about 52 in Great Britain now. There are about 52 of them. They're wonderful Victorian, they're largely Victorian. The earliest is about 1820. Wonderful pieces of engineering. They're just marvelous. And of course, they are an extension of land out into the sea, which is a sort of little holiday when you go on a pier. I always think. You take the air, you look back at the shore, and very often at the end of a pier, there's some sort of entertainment to enjoy. Now, these piers are hard to maintain, and councils say they don't have the money. Many of them are privately owned by people who do support them and love the idea. I'm a member of the Piers Association, so we keep track of what's happening. And there are certain places, Llandudno is one, where the pier is an enormously profitable enterprise because it offers various kinds of entertainment, various kinds of catering. It's a day out for the family. It's a seaside resort as well. So it's made a success of being an entertaining pier. I think there are certain places where that can happen. Southwold, for example, has a very middle class career.
Yeah, I've been there. Yeah, it's
and it sells rather posh food and strange concoctions, and it definitely has a different mood to it. The Blackpool, where I went for my holidays when I was a child, has 3 piers, and they used to always feature entertainments in the big theatre at the end of the pier. Now, those aren't very profitable anymore. And I sat on a House of Lords committee, which was about what to do about seaside resorts, which suffer economically. When everyone went to Spain, all the local resorts declined. Of course, they've got a big opportunity now this year. And one of the things that we looked into was how to make pier. I brought up the issue of piers. What a shame we couldn't reinvigorate them. And Michael Grade, who, as you know, is a brilliant sort of showbiz guru, he said there's only one way to revive piers, and that's to put a casino at the end of every pier. I felt that wasn't quite what I had in mind, but if it saved a pier from demolition, then all the better. But of course, they suffer terribly in the weather because storms attack the pier. but they'd never quite collapse because they're so brilliantly built. So you end up with a lot of derelict piers, which become a responsibility of someone to stop them damaging, decaying, hurting people, and so on. So there's always a struggle to keep them going. But I think they might revive in the year of when people stay at home for their holidays.
You're avoiding that word staycation there, because it's difficult to know what that really means, isn't it?
But a day's outing on the pier is quite fun, actually. I was on one not long ago, and they're very. There's a certain charm about walking above the sea, and they're often fishermen at the end with their lines and meager catch. There's often some slot machines, cafes, other people walking up and down. It's a promenade that moves out into the sea instead of along the shore.
I noticed that somewhere you described them as partly sinister as well, which I really like this idea.
Well, they have, of course, if you go to a pier, if you go under a pier, I've always thought they're marvelous locations for thrillers, because you've got all the sea lashing the shingle and you've got all the structures rusting and so on. They're full of opportunities for escape and adventure and so on. Yeah, I tried to write a story about that. It came to nothing, but it was quite fun to write.
Thank you very much.
Nice to talk to you.
Nice to talk to you.
Yeah, and Tara, Joan was asking me, because we both arrived earlier, how we teach creative writing, but maybe you can talk to Joan about that when she visits next year.
Yes, I'd like to know that.
Yes, well, we've got lots of creative writing specialists at the college. So,
do you have visiting writers, actually people who are operating successful writing careers? I mean, the sort of Davy Hare people of this world.
We do, yes. Claire Morgan is our main tutor to talk to about that, who runs our creative writing masters, but I'm sure she'd be delighted to talk to you about it.
How interesting, fascinating.
Thank you.
I don't think she's in the room, unfortunately, but yeah, you'll meet her when you come. So there is a question about online learning actually in the chat room from Byrne K. Is that Catherine Byrne? Do you want to switch your camera on and ask the question?
Who am I going to find here? Where do?
No, hopefully.
Sorry.
I'm trying to find you.
I apologise.
I can hear you, but I can't see you.
Can you see me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, there you are.
Yeah, I apologise. I'm currently supporting an online course, so I'm afraid my question is rather loaded. Do you think that online study has the potential to be targeted towards the population that doesn't know that continuing education exists?
Well, it's for us to make it known, isn't it? I mean, I think it's very important. I thought during the pandemic, the information that came forward about the disparity between people who had all the technology and the young families who didn't was really distressing. And I thought the idea that people in deprived homes were falling behind simply because they didn't have the technology. And I thought that was most regrettable. In fact, I called on people like, Richard Branson or something saying, cough up, let's get a laptop to every single family. But then, of course, the children need to be encouraged to use it positively and not simply to watch cartoons, not all the time anyway. So, but I do think there needs to be a way forward. We're at a point of change, as we all know now, post-pandemic. And there is an opportunity to lace together these different disciplines so that people who want to do study with other people late at night, coming to Birkbeck and so on, going to college, Kellogg, are able to use online learning too. And I think that we could integrate them both. I don't ever think anything will supersede the face-to-face confrontation with a good teacher. I just believe, I don't mean on the laptop, I mean in person. There is absolutely...
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with you. However, I think there's a place for blended learning in the post-pandemic world.
Yes, it's for us to start forging ways of how that could happen, I think. I'm sure we will come together as institutions to think how that can be used to its maximum advantage. It's no good saying, well, we've all got laptops, we get online somehow. It has to be more thought through than that, and that's up to the academics, it's up to the students and the planners. But it was interesting because when Birkbeck set up a branch in Stratford East, and I went along to see what it would be like, what the evening classes there would be like, because of course it was a much poorer area than central London, and we rather hoped to cash in on local people saying, you can go around the corner and study. And I went along to observe it. And what was interesting, I found, and I was told it was true of also of central London classes, the people who attended, I went to an accountancy class, and the people who attended were perfectly happy to join, to contribute to the lecture, not just to listen to it. And so what happened was that they said, well, I work in this accountancy firm and we do it this way, and I think that's a good idea. What do you think? And other people would respond and say, well, where I work, our business plan is written like this. Is this a good idea? So they were, in a way, educating themselves through the resource of coming together. So you can't do better than that. You can't.
I agree. It's been a pleasure to hear you today.
Right. Thanks very much. So Yasmin, do you want to switch on your camera? And Joan, Yasmin's the fellow I mentioned discovered the original Peaky Blinders when archaeology colleague were digging up parts of Birmingham for HS.
Well, I find her. Here we are. Speak up, Yasmin.
Hello, hello, Joan. Lovely to meet you. I'm a fellow in history at Kellogg, and I just wanted to loop back a bit to broadcasting and thinking about BBC and programming, because I've dipped my toe in the water a little bit in terms of getting involved with programs, history programs, and I just wondered what you thought about the quality of things which are going out. I suppose it's a question about dumbing down, because I think there's a fantastic pedagogical resource. History programs can be terrific, and other kinds of factual and arts programming. But I just wondered how you thought that production is moving and going, because often people are also talking about people having too much choice and not perhaps watching those kinds of programs that perhaps they would have all sat around the television in the past to see.
Yes, I think there are lots of conflicts here. I generally feel that watching history programs, which I search out on BBC4, let's hope it survives, I think they're very good. And I watch things like that. I think the standard is high. The research is very good. The backup on those history programs, you will know that too, because it's part of your life. The research you get is good and is checked for accuracies and things like that. And people are always coming up with new formats, which is marvelous too. I think the David Olusoga series about a house through time is one of the most wonderful ways of teaching people history. And I found, who would have imagined that would work so well? I don't even know whether it's called a history program, but it takes, as you know, a particular house and tracks its ownership to the very beginning, and then it goes through the centuries and how it changed, got richer, got poorer, who owned it, who rented, and so on. So finding new ways doesn't mean lowering standards. Very good new ideas are going to make a difference. Poor ideas are not going to carry an audience with them very much anyway. I think there's a tendency, and I'm trespassing on areas. I'm becoming opinionated now rather and ignorant, because I don't really know. But when I see a West End show, which is about the 6 wives of Henry VIII, I do rather think, and it's a musical, I do rather think, is that Tudor history? And I feel a bit sad about it. Though, of course, I suppose it's good that people know there were 6 wives of Henry VIII. It was something that was impressive to me when I was a child. So I am fearful that it can be turned into sort of showbiz. And there's perhaps that's a measure of my age, because why shouldn't it be? You know, if people enjoy it, why shouldn't it be? It's just that I want history to be a scholarly academic subject where people check the facts and don't offer a deluded interpretation of what might be going on. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of it around. I think there's an appetite for history, but I do think that program administrators are constantly aware that they must keep high audiences and high AI's audience index, which is how much the audience enjoyed the program. The ones that have a high AI get recommissioned, and those that don't, whatever their quality in academic terms, won't get renewed. So there is this battle between for an audience, which isn't necessarily contradicting the quality and the scholarship that goes into really good history programs.
And I completely agree with you about BBC4. I think it would be a great loss. Thank you very much.
Good. Let's fight for it. We don't want it to go.
Yeah, Sophie, do you want to switch on your camera?
Yes, I see you.
Start.
Is that
I don't know why it doesn't start. It says it has been stopped.
Okay, we'll carry on. At least we've got a photo of you, which is good. Oh yeah, there we go.
Excellent.
There you are.
Yes, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. I'm myself an associate professor in British history in France, and also a TV presenter of some sort. I was wondering whether you thought that the pandemic would change higher education for a long time, or whether we would go back to traditional lectures and tutorials, which are, of course, better for interaction.
There's nothing like a good tutorial, is there? I mean, I remember mine with a certain vivid pain, because I was always falling short of my lecturers, my tutorial expectations. I think going back to how things were is a phrase we won't be using. I just think we have to look forward to how things will develop, and they will develop on the solid roots of what was good beforehand. I have that hope. They perhaps won't be called lectures, but they might be called meetings, they might be called encounters, they might be called groups coming together in town halls or civic buildings of some kind, the use of old libraries, which unfortunately are closing down. So there will be, I mean, our local church, for example, runs a series of completely secular lectures, and it fills the church in the evening, and people stay and meet each other, and it's a community facility rather than a religious one on that particular occasion. So people will find ways of coming together, and they will find ways of wanting to listen to knowledge being dispensed in an attractive and interesting way. So I don't think that will die out, but I think the actual bricks and mortar will change perhaps, and certainly the way it's funded will have to be dealt with. So all the change will come to do with the surrounding, but knowledge and people talking about stuff they know and arguing about what it is. I was interviewing David Olusoga the other day, and I said, is there such a thing as finite history? Is there a set of facts that we're all struggling for? And he said, absolutely no. That absolutely no finality to history. It will go on changing and being reinterpreted. And that's why those people want to meet him and talk about it and talk among themselves about what constitutes history. We must always beware, of course, of the political implications of fixing history, so that people can have either a romantic idea of the past or perhaps a too downbeat view of the past, and some things they don't want to bring back, or some things they misrepresent. History can be a weapon in the hands of autocrats and despots. I noticed that when I was in Libya. I was in Libya when Gaddafi was in power, and I bought his textbook about the right of the people. It's a book you can't get now. It's called The Green Book. And he built on the greatness of Libya and how it was going to be great again. And it was marvelous PR. So history can be used as PR for people with villainous intent, but it can be used as PR for people with good intent. You just have to work out which is which.
Yes. Well, thank you so much.
Keep alert and defend it when you can.
Yes. So in China.
No.
Right. Yeah. Joan, sorry, is that it, Sophie? Yep. Okay. So yeah, Joan, I was just going to say you had a high bar with your tutor there, wasn't given that you for history you had Eric Hobsbawm as your tutor. He
taught me history. Yes, he was tremendously good, because he was very generous. He just would say of every statement I made, which were of course trimmed to please him, why did you say that? What's the evidence? What's the evidence for that? It's an interesting point of view, He would give me that. And he'd say, but have you got enough evidence for that? And I thought that was interesting. And he was the person who I arrived with a lot of school sixth form attitudes, one of which was that the frame breakers of the Victorian age were damaging the, the people who gave their name to breaking of, to wanting to stay in the old world and not adopt the new ways, the frame breakers and the wreckers. And he said, why do you think they were doing it? And I said, of course they would. And he made me confess, as it were, that in fact they had a case to be made. And I subsequently learned he'd written an entire paper about how this was an important workers' movement, and I hadn't read it. But he was very understanding. He understood that I was coming from a very limited education, where certain sets of words, like the word worker, someone was speaking before, Bridget was speaking about the word, how we use words is very loaded, emotionally loaded, probably by your background, your school and your parents. So worker was something that was had a sense of judgment about it.
Well, you obviously impressed him, since he later handed on the baton of president to you.
Yes, he had to be asked whether he thought that, whether it had his approval, and he said yes.
Very good. Okay, well, Karen has put a question in the chat box. Karen, do you want to switch on your camera so Joan can see you asking your question? Hello, Karen. Where will I find you? I can see you in the chat box, but where will I find you here?
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Karen.
Are you able to put your camera on?
Yes, please, thank you.
No, can you put your camera on?
Oh, I've tried to, and it says that cannot start your video because you're, oh, here we go.
Oh,
hello.
I can see you now.
Yes, pleasure to meet you, Baroness Bakewell. It's been fascinating hearing your discussion over the last this evening. I'm a real advocate for continuing education. Actually, in a few weeks, I'll be starting a course with Oxford University on investigating the Victorians, just out of pleasure, out of interest. My question was just reflecting on what you were saying about how widely known continuing education is, just whether businesses could play a role in communicating to their employees about the benefit and the accessibility of continuing education in the way that, for example, apprenticeships had a certain, people had a certain view of apprenticeships, and they were not widely taken up. So wondering if you thought that maybe that would be a role that businesses could play with that, because apprenticeships had a wide take up, and they're known now more widely than they were before, and also there's great variety of apprenticeships now that are not available compared to in the past.
Yes, I think that the take up of apprenticeships has been made more possible by the fact that the government has offered money. If people take apprenticeships, money always works it well. And we will, as we know, in the future have different working patterns. And it may well be that companies can take up the offer of time off in order to do some further education as part of their new employer-employee relationship, as part of the new contracts that employers now will have with people who often want to work from home and so on, don't want to commute every day. So new patterns of working will happen, and it's an opportunity for people to include further education, lifelong learning as part of their offer to their workforce. And I think there's an opportunity there. I don't see how it will come about easily, because there are lots of vested interest in, as proper colleges, people going and paying large sums of money year by year to study full time. But there are plenty of people now who want to see a different change in work patterns. It's a great opportunity to say further education, lifelong learning is the shape of the future. It's a large part of the future. You've just got to let it in through the door, integrate it into the pattern for the future, and it will pay dividends. And it will pay dividends in goodwill and satisfaction, job satisfaction and loyalty and all sorts of things that are precious but often unarticulated in relationships between workers and their employers.
Yes, I work in human resources, so I will take that on board in my own company.
Good, that's wonderful.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Well, we're almost out of time, but there's a question in the chat from Adrian Ailes, which speaks directly to my sort of opening remarks about how we must think of how to build links between Birkbeck and Kellogg. So, Adrian, do you want to switch on your camera so that Joan can see you and ask your question?
Yes, I see you, Adrian. Hi, I can see you.
You need to unmute.
Unmute. Thank you very much for your talks so far. I took a part-time degree at Kellogg in my 40s. I was very, very fortunate because my family supported me. I had 2 small children at the time, and also Kellogg provided an excellent environment, not only supporting me, but involving the family on various occasions.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's
I
great.
wondered if how important you see such things as family support, and if Birkbeck has a similar excellent environment as Kellogg does.
I don't know about the immediate support ongoing while you were studying, while students are studying. I can only tell you that when they come to take their degree, the number of pushchairs in the outer hall is vast, because people often bring their children to the celebration of getting their degree. And indeed, I shake hands sometimes as I hand out the degrees with mums who are holding toddlers and saying, I was pregnant while I was studying, and so I thought I'd bring them along to share the degree ceremony. So there's a great sense that if there are problems to be solved, Birkbeck will, you can approach Birkbeck and say, I'd like to do a degree in there. Now, I'm not privy to how they solve those various problems, but I know they have a lot of goodwill and intent, and families are always seen as part of the Birkbeck enterprise. Indeed, we often, David Latchman, who's the director, will often say to the audience of graduation, you have your degrees and you are parts of families, and what, isn't it time that your wife or your partner or your cousin, your aunt, your mother also had a degree? Go out there and spread the message. So we do feel a sense of loyalty beyond the individual. We know that it isn't a matter for the individual because of the circumstances which all our students have to deal with. You know, it's a very taxing thing to study after a day's work, yes. And you need support. You need support, and you need someone who understands, or people who understand how tiring and taxing it is, and can make you ratty and just tired. So our will is there, and I'm not familiar with how extensive the actual support on the ground is.
Thank you very much. It's good to know that you're bearing in mind the fact that individuals need such support, perhaps even more so in older age, that doing a degree can be a lonely, especially a PhD, can be a sort of a lonely marathon almost.
Yes, I can imagine that. I think that's something that people ought to be made familiar with before they embark. I think you've got to know what you're in for. I mean, the Open University used to have, I don't know whether it still has, well, it won't have done during the pandemic, but as part of its pattern, didn't it, the week away in which you went with fellow students and academics to stay for a week's study. And I think they tried to, you know, they felt that that was a way of addressing the loneliness of being out there studying on your own. I think that might be something we can take on board as we go forward. But I think it's an important thing. Yes, I bet it can feel very lonely if you know, as a student, you very often say to people in the bar over a coffee, I'm really stuck on this essay. I don't understand what the Jacobites were about or whatever it is. And you get an answer, you get a conversation, and you can't do that on your own. And I think conversations between students and academics is one of the most exhilarating things about education. And I think we've got to address that.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Adrian. Well, we've run out of time. This would be the moment where we pop open the champagne and all chat to Joan on the lawn, and then carry on over formal dinner. But as I say, we'll need to wait for this time next year before having that opportunity. At least it gives you a year to think up your questions for next time round. And
I shall enjoy that. I've enjoyed meeting and talking to people and really hearing the concerns. That's really important, that we, you know, the sort of posh rooms, posh gowns, things like that, listen to people and serve their needs. That's what we're for.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Joan, on behalf of the whole Kellogg College community. It's been absolutely inspirational. So thank you very much indeed.
And thank you to everyone. I've enjoyed your company. I felt you out there. I've really enjoyed sharing it with you. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye to you all. Goodbye, everyone.